Welcome to the fifth lesson of our target setting track. Today, we will be discussing the Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI. Here's a quick look at the agenda for today's lesson. We'll begin with a quick introduction to the SBTI, then get into the SBTI validation process, how to commit to or seek validation on an SBT, and finally, close it off with target setting for small and medium-sized enterprises. So with that, I'll be handing it off to Isabel to get us started.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's first talk about this introduction, or maybe more so a reintroduction to SBTI. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, which we call SBTI in short, is a corporate climate action organization, and their role is to provide the standards, tools, and guidance that companies need to set greenhouse gas reduction targets in line with what's required by climate science. SBTI is a really important program and organization because it bridges the gap between corporate ambition and climate science. So instead of companies setting targets that may look good on paper but have no real scientific backing, companies are aligning with what science says is necessary to limit global warming, and SBTI validates that their targets are in line with that. When a company's targets are validated by SBTI, it essentially serves as a stamp of approval, demonstrating to both internal and external stakeholders that the targets are credible and aligned with best practices in the climate science industry. If a company isn't quite ready for target validation through SBTI, you can still make a formal commitment to set a target through SBTI, which moves you in the right direction of getting that stamp of approval, but gives you a 24-month window to finalize and submit your target. And that kind of adds that accountability built into the process so you can begin working on your targets and prepare to set them in alignment with the leading climate scientists. So now let's take a look at who's actually setting these targets. Right now, over 10,000 companies have either committed to or have already set science-based targets. Of those, more than 8,000 companies have fully approved targets, and close to 2,000 are in that process of setting a net zero commitment, choosing to reduce their emissions to net zero by 2050. To set a net zero target, companies first need to have near-term targets in place, and those near-term targets really ensure that they're in line to make progress in the short term so that they can achieve those targets in the long term. Net zero targets come with an extra level of responsibilities, where companies are reducing their emissions to almost the absolute amount that they can, and then neutralizing those residual emissions for any small portion of their emissions that they can't eliminate through things like permanent carbon removal or storage. SBTI is also encouraging companies to look at beyond value chain mitigation, and that essentially is supporting climate solutions outside your own operations and in your supply chain, in addition to both your near and long-term targets. As it stands now, your targets won't include any beyond value chain mitigation efforts, but it's something that SBTI definitely recommends that companies do. So it's really not just about making a pledge, but when you're setting a science-based target through SBTI, there's clear rules and structures behind what counts as a credible target and what you can do to achieve those targets. And you can see that a large number of companies are committed to doing so. Now you can see a little bit more details around what it takes to set an SBT, and it's really a 4-step process. First, companies commit, and this could be a little bit optional depending on the path that's right for your business. But essentially, you'd register online and make a formal pledge to SBTI. And this is really when that 24-month window starts for you to begin developing and finalizing your targets that you have to submit to SBTI within that window. If you make that commitment or not, you then move on to developing your targets internally. This usually means testing the different approaches that SBT lays out for you and making sure that your targets line up with SBTI criteria. Developing your targets have been a big focus of our time here together and this course through Locked for Healthcare. And so hopefully you're well on your way to developing your targets. Once your targets are developed, you move to submit your targets for validation. This review process takes a few months and involves a screening from SBTI and some back and forth with SBTI on the validation process of your target. Once you go through that process and have your targets approved, companies announce and disclose those targets publicly and then report progress against your targets each year. So this is a clear process of first committing, then developing those targets, submitting to them through SBTI, and then an ongoing process of disclosing your emissions after you announce that once the target's approved. You can also see some relevant links and resources at the bottom of the screen, which could be helpful for you in each of these steps. We can now move on to the SBTI validation process. So once you have agreed on internal methodologies and aligned on what your target looks like internally, we want to discuss what you need to do to collect and present to SBTI to actually validate those targets. So in this first slide, we want to review some of the key resources and documents from SBTI that you may need to know about and start working on before starting your validation process. There are guidance documents from SBTI to help you understand this process, and we can go into more details about that in the following slides. The corporate net zero standard criteria is really the rules for all target setting as SBTI requires it now, and this will have guidance for both near-term targets as well as net zero, and it helps you make sure that the targets you're setting are aligned with what SBTI is looking for. There's an SME streamlined target validation route, which is available to SME companies. Ryan will talk us through what it means to qualify as an SME later on in this session, but that's really a streamlined route for those of you who maybe are an SME and don't need to go through the entire validation process. The SBTI Criteria Assessment Indicators is a resource that outlines the major checks conducted by SBTI during the validation process, and we highly recommend that you look at this document as it will give you a clue into what SBTI will be looking for as they review your targets, your greenhouse gas emissions, your calculations, and everything else that you submit to them to begin the validation process. The SBTI services registration is the steps you need to register your organization to be able to commit and validate your target through SBTI's online portal, which is what you go through to submit and validate those targets. And so this will really be a step one to setting up your account to start the validation process. The SBTI services and offering documents outlines the standard tiered service offerings and has price variety of the different services, so you can build an understanding of how much it will be costing to get your targets validated by SBTI. There's definitely different tiers within their service offerings based on the size of your company, and there are discounts for certain companies, so be sure to look at that so you can properly set expectations with your internal stakeholders when it comes to submitting